kind of a general summary of what I see as the benefits of the cloud. And so you really are seeing a lot of focus on that now in all kinds of quarters. Just last week, the US government announced that they now have a cloud-first policy, that they're moving their email from Microsoft Outlook to Google App Engine in the cloud, and they're basically saying if there's a suitable application or something, cloud-based solutions take preference over non-cloud solutions. So, and they're generally a fairly conservative organisation. Okay, so let's just summarise. In general, over the past few years, there's been a slow train and a fast train in the geospatial industry, and most of us traditionally have been on that slow train. And again, no offence to anyone, it's just a reflection of the maturity of the industry and the sort of application areas that we're in. But there's been this fast train with Google and Microsoft and Apple and all these guys doing a lot of cool things. Now we can't just hop off one train and get on the other one. There's a lot of valuable stuff on both of them. But again, collectively we need to figure out how do we take the best from both of them and really bring in all these things that are happening in the consumer world and add those on to what we're doing in the enterprise world. And one aspect of that, like I talked about, is really bringing in more of this multimedia data, which can be very useful for a lot of things, I think. Looking at how do we take advantage of this idea of crowdsourcing, we can really bring down the cost of data maintenance, that kind of thing. And there's another crowd, I don't know how they sneak in. And then lastly, really looking at the idea of the cloud and the economies of scale that we can get from that. I think there's really some big advantages. So anyway, it's beginning to be a wild ride, and I think it will be a wild ride over the next couple of years, which is, again, slightly scary in some ways, but I think it's very exciting overall. I mean, it really means that all the hard work we put into creating and maintaining data, we can make much more use of it and spread it out to multiple users, do a lot more things with it. So I definitely think it's the most exciting time in the 24 years or so I've been in the industry. So lots of good things to look forward to in the next year. So that's what I think. Thanks very much.
Folks, is there any questions? Neil, that's the word.
Oh yeah.
Any questions, folks?
Peter, it's very attractive, the Google offerings, but the big problem is currency. And that's the thing where you've got to be cautious about the application you put them into. One of our emergency service providers attempted to use Google Satellite in sort of for fire situations and found people will make decisions on the pictures they were seeing. Like there's a big forest here, except it wasn't.
Yeah.
There's a paddock that's all green, but it was actually tall and brown. So they had to withdraw that from that particular application. So currency is a big problem in Australia. And it's also the trouble with Street View. Houses just aren't there, and they could be not there for 5 years. So that sort of problem, it's very attractive, very persuasive technology, but it's not accurate. And until you get phase 2 that you're talking about, getting some more input into this thing and bring it up to currency, it has a limited application.
Yeah, and so, I assume we could all hear that, but basically the concern was, how current is Google? And I hear that argument a lot, and I think, there's certainly some legitimacy in it, and you see some cases like that. But I think I'd make a couple of points. I mean, one is that that's dramatically improving, and again, it depends on which area you're in, but as there's more and more competition, certainly in Denver over the past few years, they've had yearly updates. In many cases, they're more up to date than enterprises I've seen who have imagery flowing every few years. There's quite a lot you can do to overlay data where you have more up-to-date data. So, certainly when you have new housing developments or whatever, then typically utilities and telcos know about those sooner, and you're going to have data before Google does. But there are ways of adding things into the map. Again, things like OpenStreetMap are starting to get much more current. So I certainly agree there's a caution there, and I'm not saying that Google is the exclusive base map, but certainly in a lot of US utilities, the Google base map is far better than the utility has in a lot of cases. But still, I think even if you take the Google base map out of that equation or that demo I showed you, there's still a lot of ideas you can take on ease of use and that kind of thing from the Google environment comply. So I agree with you, there are some issues, but I also think that that's overstated in some cases, and in a lot of cases, well, the data from Google can be more current than from traditional things. So yeah, it's going to be a case-by-case thing, and I agree with you in some cases, but I think that will change pretty rapidly too.
Do you think there's a case for having the base level information, say on that map application, but it's having that control in some way, shape or form, then augmentations of that data or overview? Is there any way of doing that? Because you get pretty chaotic with moving roads and bridges and things like what else if it was all those things public information?
Yeah, so again, you can all hear the question, but it's really about are there ways of controlling certain aspects of the map and leaving other aspects more open? And yeah, it's a tricky balance. Clearly there are concerns about this kind of thing, and especially for emergency services and that kind of thing. But I think there are various ways of managing it. The ways that other communities have done it are things like building up levels of trust. So people's updates might not appear immediately, or if 5 people say this section of road is closed, then perhaps you automatically close it, or you start out making changes by just letting people report things, and then somebody goes and validates certain kinds of changes. Also the idea of user reputation. Somebody's submitted 10 updates before, and then every time you validate them, they prove to be right, then you automatically accept updates from that user. So there are risks in all of this, but in general, the way it's turned out in practice is that these things have worked very well. I mean, the other thing to keep in mind is that there are lots of errors in current data too, which in traditional approaches and often it's quite out of date. So, I had an interesting conversation with a guy in Colorado who had some of the same concerns, and he was, I maintain the stream data and river data from Colorado, and I'm still concerned about overriding the authoritative data with crowdsourced data. And then as we had the conversation, it turned out that the authoritative data was mainly 40 to 50 years old. And so, there is no easy answer, and both approaches can have problems, but I think figuring out the right way to kind of mix it in can help a lot. And I think a good way of putting a toe in the water is initially to let people report things, but maybe not update them directly. Maybe even submit the change, but have somebody validate it first. And then when you see, how well that works, then possibly start the changes go through automatically in some circumstances. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Jim?
What about the use of standards in this sort of space? There's obviously a lot of competitors and advantages for Google or Microsoft or whatever. With them sort of all leapfrogging each other, if you put your eggs in one, what's your ability to kind of change to another, or how do you sort of protect your investment, I suppose, when you're in this?
Yeah, so there are various applicable standards and things that are common. So, and it's kind of interesting because there's a couple of different approaches to standards. There's the OGC standards, which I'm sure probably a lot of you in the room are familiar with, that come more from the traditional GIS side, and actually in the new world those are generally dismissed as being old-fashioned and not used very heavily. I mean, not completely, and KML is actually an OGC standard, and that's quite widely used, so that's a bit of a broad statement, but the older standards are kind of less used in new web mapping space. But KML is one example of a standard, and GRSS is another, that have very simple data standards, and they're supported by most of the main new web mapping vendors, Microsoft, Google, etc. So, and that's actually those are the formats that are used for overlaying outages on trucks, that kind of thing. So that's one thing that's very common. Another is that there's a pretty standard approach, not really a formal standard, but to the way that you do map tiling. So the mechanism that Google and Microsoft both use, the same mechanism for getting very fast performance, is that the maps are basically drawn into raster images. So you're not querying a database real time when you join the maps, you're just pulling these pre-rendered tiles. And that's the same as we're doing with when we put the small data on top. so we're writing out smaller data tiles using that standard scheme. But because they all use a standard scheme, it's very easy for us to switch from using Google to Microsoft to OpenStreetMap, so that's another thing that's fairly common. So, and I guess the other thing is, in general, these applications are fairly lightweight. We've been able to go off and show you fairly quickly, so if there's some change, a lot of aspects of it are relatively easy to change. So those will give you some assurance, but obviously things are moving very fast, so you certainly have to keep on the ball.
Any other queries, folks? One down the back there. Colin.
Yeah, it's just your image of King Kong and the T-Rex just begs the question, really, if the fight's becoming between the big guys, what happens to all the traditional vendors of geospatial software? If you've now got Microsoft and Google as your, who would want to be competing against Microsoft and Google at the moment?
Yeah.
So what future do you see of the specialist vendors? Where are they going to have to go and hide to survive?
Yeah, so the question is, what does this mean for the traditional geospatial vendors? And it is a good question. I think in many ways the vendors have gone in slightly different directions, probably both Small World and Intergraph, GE Small World, have kind of focused more on specific business applications, really focused on higher level utility and telco applications. And really they're dealing with quite complex applications that probably aren't big enough markets for Google or Microsoft to go after directly. So I think in general I see those markets continuing for quite a while for those vendors. But I do think there'll be a number of applications which previously were done using a traditional GIS, which you can do using Google or Microsoft. The sort of thing that's started to show here. So I still think that the more complex applications are likely to continue to stay with those traditional vendors for quite some time. But I suppose the interesting thing will be to see if there are new generation systems that come along on top of the cheaper platforms that start to do more of the utility functionality, and that's a possibility, especially at the lower end. So yeah, it will be interesting to see how all that goes. But I think we'll still see them around for quite a while still.
All right, folks. Well, Peter's going to be here for a little while longer, so I encourage you to hang around, mingle amongst yourselves, and enjoy some refreshments. We've got some food as well. And I'd like you all to join me and thank Peter for his presentation.